David, I believe our regular viewers are going to be quite pleased with what you've organized for us today. How are you?
I'm very well, Jason. Good to be with you.
Good to see you this morning. Well, this afternoon here in New York, this morning in Vancouver. David, you're introducing a new character in this cast. I believe our regular viewers are going to be quite pleased with what you've organized for us today. How are you?
Sorry, David. I've got something.
I'm very well, Jason. Good to be with you.
Giving us audio. Good to see you this morning. Well, this afternoon here in New York, this morning in Vancouver. David, you're introducing a new character in this cast. I believe our regular viewers are going to be quite pleased with what is that coming organized for us. David, that's coming from your computer.
Oh, so what do should I do something like switch
you
something
gotta
off?
just close YouTube or mute the site
David,
or something
you're
introducing a new character in this. So we have a little bit of an echo happening there. But okay, well, it prompts me to alert everyone that today we are doing something new for the first time. We are doing a simulcast on David's recently launched YouTube channel while David gets the volume situation straightened out. Just want to alert everyone that they can now watch the show on this is the YouTube broadcast, of course. People can watch our YouTube show either on the Jason Goodman YouTube channel, the Crowdsource the Truth 2 YouTube channel. David gets the yeah, you've still got your sound on there, David, but people can also watch on the Reverse CSI Handoff Plays YouTube channel, and people will be able to join David there in his chat room. It looks like he's got a viewer, so that's good. David, how are we doing with muting the audio on YouTube? Okay, just close the YouTube window on there, David. But people can also watch.
Close Skype. Right?
CSI Handoff.
You don't need
Skype. You just need to close YouTube. And you've got a tab open with YouTube almost certainly. In his chat room, it looks like. So the new person that David is introducing into our story today is this guy, Peter Heyman, who we're going to be talking about quite extensively. He's an interesting character. You just need to close YouTube. Have you closed the tab there, David, for YouTube?
I'm just looking. I'm looking for the tab.
So the
I'm
new
sorry.
person that David is introducing. Okay. Well, we can't have audio from you. With let me make sure that that is not coming from me. I don't believe I have any other windows open.
Probably something we did yesterday.
Man, you know what? Let me just double check. Oh, I just quit out on David. Oh boy. Well, anytime you try something new, weird things sometimes happen. Let's just make sure that we don't have any unwanted tabs open here. Sorry everybody. Well, okay, let's get back to David. It's always an adventure, isn't it? This guy, Peter Heyman, is another super weirdo who was an MI6 agent. He was part of this thing called PI, which is the Pedophile Information Exchange. Okay, so David, we should have you back.
Okay, and have you got an echo or?
No, did you close the tab?
I think I did.
Very good. I think you did too.
I apologize to our
Don't
listeners.
Worry. Don't worry, David. Yeah. Everybody understands. So, okay, while we were getting that organized, I was just telling everyone briefly about this new character that you've introduced, David, who is Peter Heyman. Is that his name?
Yeah, a very, very dangerous individual, now deceased, who was a member of the Pedophile Information Exchange.
Right.
Which allegedly ran from 1974 to 1984. And he was the British High Commissioner to Ottawa and became great friends, I believe, with Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the former Prime Minister. Right? And my concern, of course, is that this guy, Peter Heyman, a high officer in MI6, British intelligence, may have taught Pierre Elliott Trudeau the rationale of using the Pedophile Information Exchange as a means to entrap and ultimately blackmail and extort leaders of the Five Eyes signals intelligence networks. Over to you.
Yeah, and the other important thing that we're doing today, David, that's a little bit of a slight adjustment from normal, is that we've titled this episode, which is, the precursor to our subscriber-only show that's going to be beginning today at 2 p.m. Eastern on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth, as well as subscribestar.com/crowdsource the truth. Everybody knows, David, that patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards is your Patreon page where you are posting daily blog posts about the various things that you research and bring to the show. So this is a great way for people to keep up during the week with the information that you're assembling. And it's also important that people sponsor David. If you're watching the show every week, even if you're just watching the free shows here on YouTube, we can't carry on these shows without your sponsorship. And people, of course, can now watch as well the YouTube preview shows on David's new YouTube channel, which I had up there just a moment ago. Let me get that back real quick. There we go. So today, David, what we've done that's a slight departure is you're actually asking this question, can the United States murder for hire statute stop artificial intelligence, pedophile entrapment, and CSI scrubbing? So what we're sort of experimenting with today is this concept of introducing a question here on YouTube and Facebook and Periscope and DLive and BitChute and all of our open platforms, and then enticing people to join us over on the sponsored platform where the question will be answered in more depth, and we go off into all the different areas that you and I usually do in these Discovery CSI sessions. Isn't that right?
Well, absolutely. And that question that you and I discussed, because the format is, kind of critical because we're using some technical words here. If Americans fail to answer that question and develop or extend or adapt the murder for hire statute to deal with the kinds of crimes we're looking at in this century that probably had never been thought of, although they may have been executed back in the 1970s when Peter Heyman appears to have been developing this pedophile information exchange. I would say failure to answer those questions, it represents an existential threat to the survival of the Republic. So it's kind of critical. Now, let me just remind audience of some of the timing here. My understanding is the RICO Act was introduced in 1970. And this was an attempt by the Department of Justice and presumably the government of the United States to address the issue that in the event of murder for hire or racketeering or extortion or blackmail, many of the witnesses were reluctant to come forward because they were too scared of getting basically whacked, if that's the right term. So they made it an offense, a criminal offense, for anyone to travel or use or induce the victim to travel or use in interstate or foreign commerce for the purposes of murder for hire. And that wording, the precise wording, was spelled out in that 1984 statute. But I don't think back then in the 1970s, whilst the mob or the organized crime understood exactly what needed to be done, or at least I believe they knew what needed to be done to avoid being picked up on that charge, I think the public or the Department of Justice in the United States didn't think that one day there would be a development in what is now known as artificial intelligence or artificial reality, where you could interfere in interstate and foreign commerce using a virtual identity or a virtual reality. And basically that virtual reality or virtual identity could be disappeared digitally or electronically whenever the people came knocking on your door to find out if you had actually arranged the murder of, let's say, Jeffrey Epstein, or the apparent murder. So I'm suggesting, and I've got some proposals, that we look at the Department of Justice, the Trump administration, look very carefully at what people understood might be murder for hire in the 1970s and bring it forward in the light of what happened in the 1990s, and in particular on 9/11 and subsequently, because I believe now that the crimes of murder for hire are now being executed through artificial intelligence algorithms, of which, or in which, I consider myself a world authority because I've been working in artificial intelligence since 1981. Over to you.
Well, it's interesting, David, because, you know, another thing that I have always been fascinated by with Crowdsource the Truth and different guests that I bring on here is that so frequently there is this synergy between guests who maybe don't know each other and aren't even familiar with each other's work. But earlier this week, people may recall I had Patrick Berge on the show for the second time, and Patrick is a retired U.S. Army. He was a private first class at the age of 40, which was a little bit unusual. And he then became a contractor to a company called Dynology that created something called ShadowNet, which basically does sort of all the things that you've always told me about. It sounds like it's using some of these kinetic North American patents to identify social media influencers and sources of information that are potentially offensive to whoever it is that might be hiring this company, Dynology. And Patrick is talking all about his own personal firsthand experience with some of the tools that you've described for so long. So it's incredibly interesting, David, how tangible evidence has been corroborating the hypotheses and the theories that you've been speaking about, whereas social engineers and their nonsense who have been trying to knock you down have fallen by the wayside one after the other. I also want to point out, David, that Global Dom is joining us in the comments saying that Rico in 1970, all the crooks came north. Another thing that you've said.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vancouver was one, obviously, prime destination. And Ottawa, I believe. That is to say, I believe in the year 2000, there was a law enforcement meeting in Toronto, and I think the commissioner of the RCMP said something to the effect that Canada has become the international hub of drug trafficking, money laundering, and organized fraud. I arrived in British Columbia in 1992, having worked around the world in some pretty dodgy regimes and jurisdictions, and I smelt corruption on a scale I'd never experienced before within a few weeks of arrival. Where that came from, we can explore, etc. But essentially, I think if you just go back to that collage that you have at the beginning, because I think
Sure.
there's a few personalities that we can just identify and try and explain using the image who the principal players of a conspiracy that I believe may put Justin Trudeau back as Prime Minister for the second term in Canada in the election on Monday. So it's kind of critical that we understand exactly where Justin came from, presumably from the loins of his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. But there's some questions about that, but I digress.
Well, I was going to ask, David, just looking at them right here side by side in the image, do you feel that young Justin looks more like Pierre, or does he perhaps bear more of a resemblance to the person who I think is his father, Fidel Castro?
Oh, totally. But, you know, again, there are so many interesting rabbit holes that we could go down. But I think, yes, there you are. You've done it. In fact, there are images where people have sort of morphed Castro into Justin Trudeau, just as brilliantly you've morphed Jessica Marcy into the face of Nicholas Soames, the Mendenhauler of 1979. But let's just stay with the collage.
Yes.
So we've got some images here. Obviously, we've got Pierre Trudeau on the right and his possibly biological son, Justin Trudeau, who's running for a second term as Prime Minister of Canada, which is obviously a very critical role from the point of view of the Five Eyes signals intelligence country, dating back to the Second World War, which is the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. Because if, as I believe, the Five Eyes signals intelligence networks have been penetrated, pun possibly intended, but not rather reluctantly, by a pedophile international exchange, then I would suggest that the Five Eyes countries had better wake up. Anyway, moving on. So to the left of my left of Justin Trudeau, we have a picture of this guy, Peter Heyman, with the twirly eyebrows, right? Who I believe was an exceedingly dangerous individual, because I believe he was a practicing pedophile, and he had the brains and access to MI6 and the predecessor of Serco, which was RCAGB 1929, to move the pedophile information exchange online. Now, I believe this guy died in 1992, which would give him plenty of time in the 80s for a couple of reasons. And may I be very arrogant, I believe I pioneered a completely different approach to artificial intelligence, having reacted. Now, up on the upper left of your image there's a picture of a man called Marvin Minsky, right? With
Let me slow you down a second, David, though, because I think we need to stay on to this guy, Peter Heyman, before we move to Minsky.
Yes.
You just said that it's your belief that he was a pedophile, but I think we should reiterate that it's not just your belief. He was incarcerated for that, or charged with that, right?
No. Peter Heyman wasn't incarcerated. That's Christopher Charles Ingvaldson, who's over on the far left of your collage.
But we've also got the BBC reporting that the diplomat Sir Peter Heyman engaged in sexual perversion, and in the
but he was never arrested.
Never arrested. So, but it was
he
found
was never
out.
Arrested.
It's basically known.
Yes.
So also,
yes.
the other thing I want to show everybody before. So this is a different picture of him, and his eyebrow is in that same really overt kind of. I mean, to me, that looks like he is specifically grooming his eyebrow to be that way. We see two different photographs of him where it looks definitely neatly brushed like that, almost as if it's something that he's deliberately doing. And I mentioned this to you last night, David. I'm not sure if you're directly familiar with the former, I think it's U.S. Army, maybe U.S. Air Force General Michael Aquino.
Yes.
He created his own satanic religion called the Temple of Set. And you will also notice that he has a similar type of swirl to his eyebrow that is deliberately introduced, and he's using it in almost every photo I've ever seen of him. So this guy was involved in some sort of child scandal on a military base in California, and definitely created his own satanic or Luciferian religion, the Temple of Set. So it immediately set off a red flag when I saw Peter Heyman having this same eyebrow, and it's another one of these steganographic winks where sort of something like this can be done in public and the average person just thinks he's a guy with weird eyebrows, but perhaps people who are familiar with what he's trying to talk about know what's up.
Absolutely. Well, his modern counterpart over on the left of your collage is Christopher Charles Ingvaldson, right, who was charged, convicted, and jailed for directing an international pedophile ring.
And he was
and here we have
Trudeau's
a problem.
best friend.
Because, well, and roommate for 2 years in 1999, 2000, and 2001. Justin Trudeau, who hopes to be a second-term Prime Minister of Canada, right? The only time Canada's ever had a father-son combination as Prime Minister, right? And this guy is the roommate of Justin Trudeau during the period, as you know, when Starnet Communications headquarters was raided on the 20th of August of 1999, and they took away all of the evidence of hardcore adult and child pornography and online gaming into 66 countries, and they took it somewhere. What I suggest is that Peter Heyman and Christopher Charles Ingvaldson developed between the period 1970, and obviously these perversions started way before then, possibly back to the founding of the Bilderbergs in 1954, right through to the present, where they have now moved a rather clumsy, slow operation for exchanging dirty images of abuse of children into a hyper-fast, on fiber optics, real-time ability to stage a murder, film it, get the evidence in front of the people who are engaged in death pool betting at luxury hotels around the world and immediately commence a scrubbing operation for what they deem to be the traffic to or from sites deemed to be questionable, that might, like you and I and many of our colleagues in alternative media are trying to do, where we engage in an attempt to do crime scene investigation when the evidence that would convict is in the custody of the perpetrator. And here is one of the greatest scandals in terms of signals intelligence that we're ever likely to see. And if we fail to dismantle this operation, as I said at the beginning of this represents an existential threat to the survival of the Republic and its Five Eyes allies and its friends around the world. Right? So now, what exactly happened on that 20th of August of raid is, I believe, they took the modern manifestation of the pedophile information exchange, which I've described as an artificial reality sexual entrapment network, where you can literally stage an artificial scene or play in a hotel room. Is it worth me just running through how I could visualize?
Before we get into that, David, I think that's going to be what we'll be discussing when the show commences in just 40 minutes on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I just want to take people through the origin of the question before we get too much into the detailed answers. And there are still some elements over here in the image for today that we might want to talk about. A lot of people have been emailing earlier in the week. This thing called Welcome to Video has been taken out. And this was an international effort by the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, this, the bunch of international intelligence or law enforcement agencies that assisted the United States in taking out this network. But we wanted to include it because, we were talking about the BBC's reporting on Peter Heyman in 2015, he engaged in sexual perversion. They also had an article in 2014 asking the question, how did the pro-pedophile group PI exist openly for 10 years? It's an excellent question. It's showing a photograph of a former KGB spy and PI member, Jeffrey Prime. It's a weird name, David. That doesn't sound like a Russian name to me. And the PI chairman, Tom O'Carroll. So, these guys were pedophiles. Obviously, somebody who's in KGB is in the intelligence world. And it's interesting that the BBC is doing this reporting on pedophilia, because we've spoken many times about how one of their most famous broadcasters, Jimmy Savile, was well known to be a pedophile, and they weren't reporting on that during his life. So BBC is in part creating an artificial reality, and in the image for today, we're talking a bit about some of the sources of artificial reality, and there's recently been some artificial reality generated around a pedophile network that we know quite a bit about, which is Jeffrey Epstein. The New York Post, which is in some ways analogous to the BBC. It's a news source. It's a major news source in a major city. And it's creating this artificial reality with virtual images of Ghislaine Maxwell that have been pretty definitively determined to be manipulated in Photoshop. We've also included this image of Jeffrey Epstein speaking with artificial intelligence carpetbagger Marvin Minsky, now deceased. But it's not just random thoughts and ideas that we're throwing together to come to these hypotheses. They are all well-founded in publicly available evidence, news reports, statements from well-known individuals, elements from the patent office. And you've been building a theory, David, actually a series of theories, for a long period of time that just keeps getting stronger and stronger. And we've included President Trump here, smiling like the cat that just ate the canary, because he may know the answer to your question for today. It is, in fact, possible that the United States murder for hire statute could stop an international artificial intelligence-driven pedophile entrapment network, and it's possible that President Trump is in the process of doing that.
And he could short-circuit that process by calling you up. I mean, I don't necessarily need an invitation to the White House, but I do believe he should talk to you rather quickly, because the enhancement or the adaptation of the murder for hire statute, it just requires a couple of words, and I'm just speculating what they might be. But if I look at it, if I understand it correctly now, it presently states something to the effect that anyone who uses or travels or induces the victim to use or travel in interstate or foreign commerce, or uses the mail or the post, right, to enable that same process for the purposes of murder for hire, where death results, is looking at life sentence or the death sentence. And all I'm suggesting is, because back then, I think it was put out in 1984, they wouldn't have understood some of the things that instinctively I understood, because I was in that business in artificial intelligence, where in 1981 I was appointed as the first director of artificial intelligence and geoscience research at the Schlumberger-Doll Research Center in Ridgefield, Connecticut, where Marvin Minsky was a consultant. Now, I don't mean to be disrespectful about Marvin Minsky, but I looked at the theory he was promoting at Schlumberger, and I looked at the theory promoted by a guy called Ed Feigenbaum, who I think is also deceased, from Stanford University. And I looked at my experience in the oil industry, meeting with people who were expert at interpreting data. And the two consultants, I believe, were 100% wrong in their attempts to represent human expertise. And I'll be arrogant, I think I was 100% right. Anyway, cutting a long story short, I believe there were people watching me, and I'm not paranoid. I think Kissinger said, "You're not paranoid if they really are coming for you."
Yeah.
I look back on my career that started in the 1980s in artificial intelligence. I pioneered a totally different approach. I built a working system called HESPER for Brit Oil in Glasgow. I invented a couple of systems and ran out of money to take them into commercial use. One was the deductive computing machine. The other was the object-oriented fractal paintbrush. But I believe the people who were watching me as I developed this picked up some of those techniques, but not all of them, because the technique I was 100% focused on was taking the artificial reality developed inside the computer of what the oil fields might look like, and later, of course, it could be crime scenes, and test the artificial reality as a theory against the data extracted from the system or the oil field.
Ground
and that's
truthing,
essentially
as
what
it were.
people. You've got it. So my entire career from 1981 onwards is about recognizing the power of computers as aids to visualize what's going on in an oil field or at a crime scene, not detaching the computer from the human being, who can use advanced pattern recognition techniques, including what kinds of motives might be driving the instigator or the perpetrator. So that's a roundabout way, basically, of saying what they did, I believe, in the 1980s was take some of my ideas, but not the ground truthing component, and start applying it to racketeering and influence corrupt organizations at crime scenes, to basically isolate the mens rea of the real people through a computer that's using artificial intelligence algorithms. So the computer with artificial intelligence algorithms can be blamed for murdering people. And that's what's happening today. We're chasing ghosts. We're chasing virtual identities. We're chasing virtual wizards. And I think if you go back to that image where I would describe Trump's expression as something of a smirk, I don't think, as bright as he might be, he has begun to understand that it's impossible to extract the truth from 18 alphabet soup intelligence agencies, falling over themselves, contradicting themselves, engaged in turf wars. So he's sitting on a powder keg of ignorance, willful ignorance, negligent ignorance, or whatever it is. So it's tragic, because now there are people dying in large numbers around the world, maybe Kurdistan or whatever it is, where artificial intelligence algorithms, and I think the late Peter Heyman would understand that very well, are driving America's foreign policy and the Five Eyes foreign policy. And we're heading for a disaster that could happen tomorrow. Over to you.
Wow. Well, let's hope that that doesn't happen. You know, David, it seems that Feigenbaum is still alive. He's,
Oh, well.
it says he's 83, and he was born in Weehawken, New Jersey, which I could actually just take a little walk over to the west side and see Weehawken, New Jersey. But I don't know, maybe we should contact Ed Feigenbaum. Is there anything worthwhile to speak to him about?
Well, with all due respect to him, his approach to artificial intelligence was using rule-based theories. That is to say, you put a set of rules together and say, if it's black, it's African American, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with all of that, it collapses because there's an exponential growth, the number of rules that you need to describe something, and then the real world is so complex that it always moves away from a rule-based analysis. So I rejected that. I mean, he probably doesn't even remember that I rejected it. But moving on, the problem with the artificial intelligence algorithms, let me give you an example. In that patent taken out by, what is he, Jerome, what's his name, his surname? Jerome Lemelson, that's right. Prisoner tracking. What he talks about is you can track the prisoners with artificial intelligence algorithms which downgrade or upgrade the privileges associated with the prisoner doing what he's told. And you can track the prisoners geographically through, for example, a crime scene. Well, as far as I can see, what that ushers in is the possibility that you could deploy prisoners with different skill sets into a hotel the night before a crime occurs, such as the Pentagon City Sheraton Hotel outside the Pentagon, or the Marriott Hotel at the base of the Twin Towers. All you need to do is brief the different compartmentalized prisoner groups, which might include the snuff film crew that maybe take out Peter Gansey Jr. because he's the fire chief of the fire department of New York and you don't want him to appear as an expert witness, or another group of people that you could call the spinners that basically project the script or the story that they want you to believe explains what Dr. Thomas Barnett described as the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history. And then you come to the most dangerous people, in my opinion, what I call the scrubbers, right? Because what the scrubbers are employed to do, maybe at the crime scene, but more particular ever after the crime has been committed, is to try and partition the data from the crime scene that might be the time index data that described the sequence of events that led up to the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history, and park that in the custody of the people who perpetrated the crime. And unbelievably, on September the 1st, 2000, and I'm pretty angry about this because I see this as a betrayal by powerful groups of the values, the best values of the Five Eyes countries. And I'm not saying that they're sinless, because obviously the Five Eyes countries over the years have done some pretty bad things. Nothing on the scale of the countries that Pierre Trudeau loved, for example, Russia and Syria and Cuba and China. So what these people can do is actually start scrubbing or isolating the data that is necessary to solve the crime. Well, on September the 1st, 2000, the National Crime Squad in the United Kingdom transferred custody of its information technology networks, including all of the most sensitive data that is necessary to solve the crime. We're talking about breach of chain of custody, to the British company Serco. And what I'm saying is September the 1st, 2000, September the 1st, 2000 to September the 11th, 2001, that gave Serco the possibility of setting up what I call 8-act plays at crime scenes that involve dispatching or deploying specialists, like environmental cleaners outside the Pentagon, to do a particular task where each compartmentalized specialist group was not aware of what the other specialist groups were doing, right? Including going back into the information technology network in the custody of Serco at the National Crime Squad and making sure that no one, and I think this is the encryption, I think they call it the sandbox, was sniffing around the information technology network of the National Crime Squad that might have learned, which might have taught them how the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history was staged, and by whom? Over to you.
Yeah. Well, David, we're almost out of time with our preview broadcast here, which, you and I have been making an effort to make it not just an advertisement to get people to sponsor the show, although we really do want that. It's become its own sort of standalone show, and our hope is that what we discuss here will be interesting and tantalizing enough to our viewers that people will come over and sponsor patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards, patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth, and subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth. In just about 25 minutes, David, we're going to be starting our longer form show over there. So people who are not yet subscribed to either your page or the Crowdsource the Truth page should definitely go over to Patreon and sponsor both sites. I couldn't do this show without David, and it's just becoming increasingly important each day that independent news and controversial topics like this are supported by the viewers, because there's been a huge effort, not just by the social engineers that we're talking about to stifle this information, but also by the major news outlets and social media outlets. It's been spoken about quite a bit for a pretty long time now, but it's going to kick into high gear, and there's no way of knowing when this show could be taken out. So become a sponsor today and help us keep bringing this type of information to you. David, I don't know if everyone is aware that you still have your wonderful free website, the really beautifully designed reverse CSI scripts that people can visit. You've got the playlist for all of our YouTube videos that we've created, so people can review past videos and have a very convenient location for it. This was really a good one last week, talking about the 60s scoop. A lot of people didn't know about that, including me. It's such a horrendous piece of history that is so infrequently spoken about. So again, talking about some of these topics that they've tried to bury in the news is what we are doing here, and it requires your sponsorship for us to carry on in doing that. David, in the last few minutes, is there anything that you wanted to cover before we switch over?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jason, for that opportunity. I'd just like to restate the question, right, which we introduced the show with, which is, can the United States murder for hire statute, right, stop pedophile entrapment and CSI scrubbing? Now, I believe pedophile entrapment has now reached around the world, penetrated all of the departments of justice and law investigators, and the prime purpose of that is to intimidate or terrify or blackmail or extort the silence from witnesses to this notion of murder for hire using interstate or foreign commerce or the mail to introduce that. So it's the negative side of crime scene investigation. It's not so much that they produce a compelling theory. They stop whistleblowers or whistleblower sites or investigative sites like yours and mine from getting at the real data, without which you can't solve the crime. So one of the things I would do if I was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, or the President of the United States, or the Prime Minister of any of the Five Eyes countries, I would demand access to the data archives that Serco has in its custody at the National Crime Squad. And when you get access to that, you will have all of the data, the time in text data, the geo-reference data, the thin thread type data, necessary to solve great crimes, I believe, back to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Over to you.
Yeah. Well, David, we'll be talking some more about the Starnet Communications raid, what Christopher Ingvald's son and Justin Trudeau may have known about that. I've just discovered in a little discovery on the fly that this security guard, Anthony Marr, this is the first time I've seen the Globe and Mail Canada edition from August 10th, 2000, where they say almost 1 year after police raided the downtown Vancouver offices of Starnet Communications International, one of the company's former security guards has been charged with possession of child pornography. David, we've spoken extensively how the CEO of that company was not charged with anything. He remains free and apparently living in Brazil. It's weird that the security guard would be charged, but the CEO who's making the child porn and selling it and making $900 million from it would not.
And maybe the de facto director, not on the company books, for the production and distribution of hardcore child pornography was Christopher Charles Invaldsson, the roommate and best friend of a guy who wants to be serving a second term as Prime Minister of Canada with an election on Monday. So I would suggest in any way that we can interfere with that, interfere is a very important word from the point of view of a RICO conspiracy. I think it's important we at least share our understanding of this pedophile information exchange with the public at large, not just in Canada and the United States. Over to you.
Absolutely. Well, David, we're just about ready to transition over to our sponsor exclusive show on patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I look forward to seeing you over there, and I want to thank all of our generous Patreon and Subscribe Star sponsors. Couldn't do this show without you guys. We look forward to seeing you at 2 p.m. Eastern, just 20 minutes from now. David, thank you so much, and I will see you there.
Thank you, Jason. Bye for now.